Welcome, everybody. This is Darin Francis from Signals in Higher Ed and Harbinger Lane Consulting. I'm joined today by Kevin Harrington of Rize Education. Kevin, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Darin. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Excited to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So I gave you a little bit up front that we're talking about experiential learning, and I've been in conversations with Charlie and Anastasi in the past. I've talked to Dr. Docking at Adrian College, and you and I have had a few conversations in the past as well. So I feel well prepared to talk Rize at the big level, but we've never talked about experiential learning. And so I really want to kind of get into that element of your product and understand it further. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about your core model, and let's give people that maybe haven't heard of Rize a little bit of how you got started, how you landed on really program sharing, and then we'll kind of go from there.
So I was in New York City working in finance in 2016, 2017, 2018. And my co-founder and I both were coming to the realization pretty quickly that wasn't really like the career path we wanted, and really wanted to go work on something that we felt like was moving the world in a direction we felt good about. Higher ed was one of those like meaty problems that felt like we could dedicate 20, 30 years of our life to. And so we started studying the space, but I think quickly came to the realization, well, no one in this space is going to listen to or want to work with late 20 somethings in New York City who've never worked in higher ed before, for good reason, probably. And so we had an extremely lucky stroke where we met President Jeff Docking of Adrian College, small liberal arts campus in rural Southeast Michigan, who, for whatever reason, took a liking to us and saw a lot of the problems within higher ed similar to the way we saw them. And he eventually had the idea of us moving to Adrian and becoming his assistant to the president for innovation, living in student housing, working down the hall from him, and really capitalizing on the early innings of a model that him and 10 other schools had essentially collaborated on with Google that would allow them to share Google provided curriculum computer science across those 10 or so schools, making it a lot more efficient than each of them having to create that curriculum on their own, hire their own professors, et cetera. And so we sort of took that early beginning and worked with him and those other schools to begin working on a program sharing model, which it quickly became apparent that was the core need of these institutions who are under extreme cost pressures, extreme sort of relevance ROI pressures. And when 60% of your operating budget essentially goes to the classroom model, it's only a matter of time before some real innovation collaboration sort of needs to happen there. And so that was the sort of long-winded journey to Rize.
As you got started thinking about program sharing, there's a big ROI there around just reducing the cost of creating new programs, but there's got to be a lot of friction on two counts. One is the friction of introducing online education to a traditional residence type environment where it's not usually accepted. And then the other is just collaboration between institutions. Those hurdles seem crazy, but you and I are talking now where you guys have got 120 institutions or so on board. So maybe talk a little bit about what your journey was there to going from the initial ideation to kind of getting consensus and approval for this concept.
I'll start with the sharing one, the sharing component, because I think you're right that both sharing academic programs and doing so using a small number of online classes back in 2019 when we arrived on Adrian's campus were both fairly kind of radical, controversial ideas for almost every campus we were working with, most of whom are 150-year-old plus residential, on-campus institutions. So I think what really helped us with the sharing one is that as early as 2014, 2015, there was this group of presidents who came together, led by President Michael Alexander, President Docking, and others, who said, guys, this business model is just broken. Like, we can sit around and wait for this wave to hit us, or we can be proactive. And when they say the business model's broken, I think concretely what that really means is our costs continue to go up and to the right, our costs of this education, especially the on-campus education. And yet we seem to have hit a price ceiling in terms of what families are willing to pay, which means their perception of the ROI of this degree has hit a ceiling and is sort of turning the opposite direction. And so we, therefore, as institutions, need to somehow figure out a way, how do we both lower our costs, our budgets, sort of tighten the belt, while also expanding into the skills and subjects and increased relevance that families are demanding from us. Those two goals are very much at odds with one another. The only way you can sort of do more with less is by collaborating with other like-minded, similar institutions in a format like this one. And so as we had those conversations, and more presidents, even and provosts and deans were sort of coming to the same realization that, like, this business model of all of us doing everything on our own has just fundamentally run out of steam. It's a disservice to our institutions, to our faculty, to our students. It made this sharing model all of a sudden a little bit more palatable over time. And then in terms of the online, I do think, in order to share, you have to move things online, because we're not going to commute students back and forth between campuses, many of whom are on opposite coasts of the country. But importantly, I think COVID was like an incredible accelerant. If you want to talk about like the silver lining of such an enormous tragedy, I think it sort of accelerated innovation that might have taken 5 to 10 years, if not longer otherwise, because it both showed students, this is actually kind of additive. This can be additive if done intentionally to my 4-year degree and to my experience and to the opportunities that I have available to myself. Maybe more surprisingly was actually the impact it had on faculty's perception, which is, even with like the worst control trial for online courses you possibly could have designed, which is basically telling a bunch of faculty over a weekend, you've got to put everything online. These are courses that weren't designed to be online.
Right.
Total disaster in many respects. Even coming out of that, faculty's openness to online took a massive improvement through that period. And so all of a sudden, what was before going to be pretty controversial became sort of a viable option for us.
I think, where to go from that? I think there's a few thoughts. One is your by addressing sort of such a critical set of needs. The first thought is, I'm amazed that it was, private liberal arts colleges that came together and saw the challenge and were able to identify it and then start to approach it with urgency. Like in higher ed, I don't think of them as the first movers, but really in this sense, they're the first movers on solving a major problem, which is the cost of the education. But then core to this conversation really is getting back to this idea of the content and that you guys were then to go and develop. And so now what I'm thinking about is, experiential learning was core to what you were going to do from the beginning. Why did you see that so brightly? Like, what was the underlying piece of why experiential learning was going to be core to what you were going to design?
So when we first arrived on Adrian's campus, the first thing we did was interview a ton of students, a ton of employers, and a ton of faculty and deans and administrators. And while experiential learning is not necessarily pervasive across higher ed, I don't think it's because there isn't a large consensus that it is the future and it is where schools would like to go to. Because, the actual implementation can be really quite difficult. You've got governance processes, academic freedom, all of these sort of challenges, and just like a resource challenge of like, how do I go collaborate with the employers or the practitioners to like do this? Most faculty, to their credit, don't get provided with like nearly the resources or support or bandwidth to go do experiential learning well. If anything, they're being asked to teach more courses and more sections and advise more students than ever before with like the budget needs of these schools. And so it was really just learning from those interviews and talking to those three different sort of cohorts that led us to this like obvious realization, like, oh, we need to orient everything we do around getting students to actually replicate real on job sort of exercises. And to your early point, if you don't mind me piggybacking on it, we get the question all the time, like, why are you working with small private colleges and universities? Like, why take a bet on this cohort of institutions who, you're right, historically, I don't think most people think of them as being the most innovative. But when we actually look at, we very much here at Rize believe that there is a radically better business model available to almost every college and university in the country. And so when you think about, well, who actually is the most likely and who actually can most quickly adopt that new business model, it is the small private four-year colleges. They have the least regulatory red tape standing in their way. They are small and therefore like the most agile and the most nimble. And perhaps most importantly, because they are right at the edge of sort of like the need, like these market headwinds are hitting them probably first and foremost. They don't have the luxury of time. And therefore, while right now you might look at them and say they're like kind of the most at risk, I actually think they are the most likely candidate of school to like adopt a radically new business model that really makes them thriving and healthy, 10 to 20 years from now.
Yeah, no, certainly you're painting a good picture of sort of where the urgency came from, and then everything that follows after is just good business sense, right? So you, I think, now have, or I should say, the platform enables 30 plus new majors, and I wanted to kind of understand a little more about the curriculum development. How do you decide on like what's going to be covered, and is that kind of also a part of a shared process of these member institutions, or do you go out and do independent research and then kind of bring it back? How do you determine what's going to be next in development?
In terms of the selection of subject or major concentration, whatever you want to call it, it's a fairly simple process of just surveying all of our member institutions pretty regularly on what they want and need, and then lining that up with like the Lightcast data or grade decision intelligence data to just see like where's there the largest supply demand gap both on the enrollment side and on the job side. And that you combine those three data sources and you've got like fairly reasonably simple answers in terms of what subjects we should have a presence in. Once we sort of come to an agreement on that, the next step is that we sort of as a consortium contract with a leading researcher and leading practitioners in the field to build online native curriculum from the ground up. We don't just plug into an existing college's courses that probably aren't designed for an online delivery. And we do that to make sure that those learning outcomes from day one are taking advantage of like the cutting edge of the field and what practitioners are actually utilizing and seeing in their day to day. Once they've lined up those learning outcomes and the syllabi for the courses, we actually compile like a curriculum committee that includes faculty from across our colleges and those practitioners to make sure that curriculum is updated every year with the right learning outcomes, as these fields, especially things like AI or digital marketing or supply chain, like naturally evolve pretty quickly. And we find usually multiple teaching colleges whose faculty sort of raise their hand and say, we are going to oversee this curriculum. We are going to teach it here at X college, and we're going to do so online with your support to these other member institutions across the consortium, utilizing these like shared resources of a curriculum committee and leading researchers and practitioners that no one college can generally afford to do on their own.
That's great. What about how do you source the employer side? And you already mentioned Google. Like, can you name or talk to the are most of your employers going to be household names like Google, or do you have different size organizations that you work with? How do you source the employer side?
We have all different sizes. Google's an example of sort of several companies where it's really google.org, their nonprofit side, where we actually have like their formal endorsement of the curriculum as a corporation. But most of our actual collaboration are with the actual people in these roles at these corporations. Who sit on these curriculum committees, bring that credibility because they work at Tesla or Facebook, but are the actual ones doing that sort of day-to-day work. It sounds sort of simple maybe, but we really just do a ton of like LinkedIn outreach to these people. Look for the right position, the right skill set, the right companies that we sort of want the credibility from, who we think are sort of on the forefront. Make sure there is a mix of both like, large Mag 7, Fortune 500, but also small businesses because their needs differ and our students get employed all over the spectrum. And then we do find that because we can bring so many students to bear and so much scale, the impact that these practitioners feel like they can have makes it kind of a no-brainer for them. I mean, they're not, we pay SMEs for every subject to like make sure we have someone like truly accountable to the learning outcomes. But in terms of these curriculum committees, like they do it out of their own goodwill, out of the kindness of their hearts, because they say, hey, here's a way that I can, with a limited time investment, have an impact on 10,000, 20,000 students, 50,000 students. And so it is an example of where this model can really beautifully lead to not just cost savings for schools, but actually outcome and experiential enhancements for students. Because what small private school with a computer science department with maybe 5 to 10 completions a year could get such a fulsome roster of practitioners from these name brand institution or companies, working with them day to day to ensure their students are leading the best stuff.
And I wouldn't have guessed that at all. I was going to assume that, that on the employer side, there would need to be some other motivation to be a part of this. I guess, are there points where, is there an employment angle for any of these employers where they're hoping that by exposing their, philosophy or their ideas, that they're actually helping train their own future employer or employees, and has that come to fruition in any way that you can measure?
Great question. So that I would almost say you've perfectly summarized the next step of our sort of product roadmap. Now that we have this year, probably like 12,000 students in our classes, essentially a large enough sample size that you can go to an employer and say, hey, this is like worth your time, even some of the larger ones. Our next step is to start building in the assessment tools in partnership with employers, to actually create the sorts of hiring channels that you just mentioned, which is not going to happen overnight. It's not a like insignificant challenge to sort of do. But I think the benefit of a model like this is that any one of these colleges does not have the scale to go get a bunch of these large employers to come to their campus career fair every year, or to engage with their career service offices in any meaningful scope. They're instead forced to go to like the big public flagships because those are the people who can like meet their scale requirements efficiently. This is a model by which we can actually help employers plug into the hundreds of smaller campuses out there with amazing students, amazing faculty, producing amazing outcomes, and say, hey, there's sort of a one-stop shop for you to come and engage with all of these schools. And so that will be kind of the next step on our roadmap, hopefully.
In a way, you're kind of creating another side to the marketplace for Rize.
Yeah, exactly. And for these schools. Yep.
Yeah. And I guess that's maybe where I might leave the employer side of this, is just what's the strongest alignment between the institution needs and the employer needs? I mean, is it just kind of coming back to the trying to produce the right the right talent at the schools, or is there something else that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think when we interviewed all those employers in the early days, I think they felt like the skills that the grads they were hiring were getting from their college degrees were not matching up with what they needed. There was just sort of a mismatch. And so I do think higher ed's incentives and employers' incentives in this case are extremely aligned. It's not because of sort of perverse incentives, at least at the institutional level, that this mismatch is occurring. I think it's mostly like a resource bandwidth um, problem, in that when you look at least for these smaller schools, what faculty member, especially today with all of the budget cutting, them being asked to teach more sections than ever before, advise more students than ever before, probably pick up more extra jobs around campus than ever before. Like, who has the time to go talk to a bunch of local businesses, larger businesses, collect those needs? Oh, by the way, do it every single year in some of these frontier fields that are evolving so quickly, then go incorporate that into their curriculum and turn around and teach that the next. I mean, it's just not feasible. These jobs are already more than full-time jobs at this point. And so I think having a lightweight layer like what Rize provides, and other companies, Ripen, Podium, et cetera, and what like a Lightcast and Gray DI and UQ Solutions are trying to provide as well, in a different way, is going to be a part of the solution going forward. And it can actually help these schools, really spend more of their time doing what is truly going to impact students, and spend their time a lot more productively by increasingly outsourcing some of this sort of discovery and updating of like what skills matter today versus tomorrow versus 5 years in the future.
It's a good point. Yeah, the skills landscape is presumably going to change, and having a real beat on where that's headed also keeps your curriculum fresh, and keeps these institutions sort of at the bleeding edge, which you, again, wouldn't have guessed that was where it was going to come from. But I think it's makes a lot of sense. So we're talking to a lot of founders, companies talk about experiential learning. And one of the things that I'm learning in the process is that when you introduce to students earlier on or along the way, some of the tangible elements of what a career might look like, it's actually, starting to show, when it can be tracked, there's actually good data that suggests that it improves things like retention. But I feel like with you, what you're saying is you're actually seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're seeing with Rize an ability to actually improve on the enrollment side of the student life cycle. I'm curious, and I think you're talking about career outcomes as being a positive net return for students that are going through Rize program. Are you tracking, and do you see any evidence of sort of retention being an element of the effect of these programs?
Yes, absolutely. And, we think of our value proposition, if you want to put it that way, of Rize being sort of the same value proposition of an academic program more holistically. Make my campus more marketable, help me retain students more effectively and at higher rates, and help me improve the actual job outcomes that students get upon graduation. In our classes every semester, and going to drop out until this major sort of popped up or came onto my radar. They essentially say, I would no longer be at this institution if it weren't for this program being available, as like a really great testament to the retention ROI of these programs. And we average something like 1 or 2 students per program per year saying that for each campus that we work with. I do think we've worked with a lot of partners on trying to figure out, what is leading to retention drop off. How can we combat that? And by far the biggest survey response, the most common one is, it's financial in nature. I'm dropping out or I'm transferring or whatever for financial reasons. Now, to me, I think what's actually happening there a lot of the time isn't necessarily that students, families, financial situation just changed all of a sudden, or that the cost of their degree changed all of a sudden, but more so that their perceived value of that degree has changed. And therefore, what they're really saying in that survey result is this degree, rightly or wrongly, no longer seems worth it to me, which means that we are failing them in showing them, in answering that why question of why am I here? Why is what I'm studying relevant? And ultimately, why is this 4-year degree in this subject and this major going to lead me to a better life for me and my future family? Like, that is what every student is asking themselves every day when they wake up and every day when they show up to class. And so what we really try to prioritize in our shared programs is really showing the student both very early in that first intro class and throughout their 6 or 7 major specific courses exactly why it is they're learning what they're learning, and making sure they're hearing that both from labor market data and from actual practitioners through filmed content and live series where they say, okay, you're going to do this assignment, in putting together a logistics map in your supply chain management 101 class. Here's why I use this every single day and why it's going to help you be employable at a company like where I work, like Harry's Razors or something. And that really helps resonate with these students, gives them more confidence that the time and investment they are making into this program, into this college education more generally is going to be worthwhile.
I think that in some of the work that we've been doing for the last 6 months or so, just surveying institutions and leaders at higher ed institutions, actually more so on the public side. But I think this is probably more universal. But we're hearing basically curriculum-wide mandates to give all students more experiential learning for the reasons I think that you're highlighting, right? And so it becomes kind of a business question for you, but like you're building, right now the problem that you've been solving has been primarily focused on getting the right programs in place, right? But do you see an opportunity down the way to almost decouple from the programs and create content maybe more on an interdisciplinary course level that can just be one-off courses that students can take? Because what I'm starting to see is that regardless of where the student is on their journey, if higher ed institutions want to have experiential learning all along the way, that's not all program specific content. So I'm just curious your thinking on, like, could you end up seeing yourselves kind of fitting into building out, other types of interdisciplinary courses or other types of content beyond just the program shift that you've been thinking about?
I think you're exactly right. And it's definitely coming up on our roadmap as well. It's not going to happen this coming spring semester, but hopefully in the years ahead, we will get there soon. What I see happen all the time is, boards of trustees and maybe administrators say, oh, this experiential learning thing is a no-brainer. I read about it in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed, like everyone's on board. It's kind of a no-brainer. Let's start to mandate this across our curriculum. And then the provost or the dean or the faculty member actually goes to do that. And they're saying, oh, well, in order to do that well, like that's a big project. Again, I would need to go talk to employers, actually build something with practitioners, people in the field. Like, these are not simple things to go incorporate. Where's my budget for it? And then it comes back to the administrator who says, oof, well, it's hard for me, or maybe the CFO's office, it's hard for me to justify the ROI on this investment. Like, is it going to immediately improve my enrollment class next year? Is it going to immediately improve my retention next year? Is it going to, lead to better job outcomes next year? And the answers are probably no, 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 in terms of like that time span. And in today's environment, like CFOs, presidents, provosts, boards are having to like evaluate investments on like a 1 to 2 timeline horizon because they don't have the luxury of investing for that much longer, given how difficult the market is right now. And so it just ends up in this sort of getting batted back and forth. We hope to help with that by allowing sort of both sides to have their cake and eat it too, by taking our existing courses, which we very much already approach in this manner, and beginning to like modularize the different assignments, assessments, individual courses, but hopefully going even more granular. Can you start to partner with faculty to say, hey, you're building a course in I don't know, data analytics, and you really want to make sure that that Python assignment is being done in such a way that incorporates how AI and these technologies like Cursor and Windsurf have changed the nature of Python programming or any sort of programming. Like, let me just go adopt that assignment and incorporate that, which I know will then be updated every year, rather than me having to like build a whole course around it and do all that work myself. So I hope that we will be able to partner with faculty in that way, over the next kind of like couple of years. But I do think it's a really large, difficult challenge for a lot of institutions out there.
No, I think it's exciting. I think the whole field is exciting. I think your place in it is really pivotal right now for the smaller private institutions, and I think it'll be just as pivotal as you start to get into the publics more. I think the question I'd ask you, kind of going back to your core client today, is a new provost that's thinking about how to add more programs and trying to think about sort of future proofing their institution. Where should they start in this journey? Like, I feel like you're having these conversations on a regular basis with provosts, presidents, CFOs, and the like. Like, where do you think a new institution on this journey needs to start there from a strategic standpoint?
When we think about what we believe the sort of business model of the future to be for these sorts of colleges, small private colleges that we sort of know and love and serve, I think the increasingly important question is, like, why us? Like, why should a student choose us over the increasing number of alternative options out there? And I don't think a sufficient answer anymore, or certainly over the next 5 to 10 years, is going to be, we spread ourselves really thin and do a little bit of everything. I think a much better answer is going to be, what are the fewer things that we can do exceptionally well and really hang our hat on and build a brand around? And I don't just mean like fewer subjects, but I mean like, really focus on certain experiential learning opportunities outside of the classroom, really focus on certain campus environment investments, student success investments, like whatever that it is for you, or those its are for you. How do you free up as many dollars, time, and resources to invest into those things? Because that's going to be the secret to you differentiating yourself further and further and being successful for the long term, which means those areas where you are not going to hang your hat, it's not that you're not going to have a presence in this particular programming language in computer science or in supply chain management. You're just going to collaborate with other institutions on that to make sure you're doing it at a cost structure and a reliability level that makes you feel good what you're providing to your students, and make sure that you're like ROI positive on all of those other areas that are outside of your sort of like core skill set. So it's a long way of saying, I think the most pressing question, whether you're coming to work with Rize or just generally speaking, is like, what are we going to really try to be best in class at? And what is our brand and unique differentiation or value prop in the market? How do we free up as much focus, time, and financial resources on those things? Rize may be a solution to sort of help you do that.
That sounds right. And I think in closing here, we've hit on a ton of different areas. We focused quite a bit on sort of the institution side, the employer side, really the outcomes side of things from a student perspective, which is really where experiential learning ends up being oriented towards typically. I'm just curious, is there something we haven't talked about that you think is important to the conversation? Are there questions I should have asked?
I think you've asked some great questions, so I'm struggling with that one. Maybe the last thing I would just leave people with is I think these sorts of schools, but most schools are sort of still operating in a business model that was built in like the 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe the 80s. Every college doing everything themselves, trying to be a little bit of everything. And I think a lot of what we're finding here in terms of morale dropping off amongst faculty and administrators, budgets declining, people being asked to do multiple jobs, and ultimately like departments and even college closures sort of accelerating a bit is just a like natural market reaction to a business model that needs to be adjusted a little bit while preserving everything we know and love. And I think what we see on the ground is a ton of colleges acting proactively to that market reality that they're finding, putting in a lot of amazing work and time into sort of adjusting this model, reasonably quickly here, despite what the headlines say, which is sort of all doom and gloom. And so I just think, when you actually get onto these campuses and see the work that's being done to transition these schools into a model that like preserves everything we know and love about small private higher education in America, while meeting the market and today's student where it is, which is very different than 1970. Like I think you are going to see a lot of these schools emerge healthier, better for students, better for faculty, better for administrators and their broader community than ever before over the next 10 to 15 years here. But it does require some sort of tough decisions and confronting some difficult truths and adjusting sort of accordingly. But we're seeing some really great work across the space being done, and would encourage people to try to partner and work with as many of these schools as possible to help them with that.
I love it. I think I would encourage institutions to reach out and speak with you and your team more, because I also think that just hearing some of the institutional stories will put you on your back foot. Like it's so inspiring to hear Dr. Docking talk about what's gone on at Adrian. I know that that's one of 120 plus institutional stories that you've got to tell. And I think the framing that you've given in terms of this being the right moment is just really critical for institutions. So I look forward to hearing more about your ongoing success, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Darin. It was a pleasure and really appreciate you bringing me on.